Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Chris Saines. I'm Director of the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art, and it's a really great privilege, together with my colleague Geraldine Kirrihi Barlow, who's the Head of International Art here at the Gallery, to welcome you to this conversation. Before we do, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we gather today, the Turrbal and Yuggera people, and I recognise them as having for millennia been the first creative and visual artists of this place, here on the edge of the river at Kurilpa Point. I want to pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise the contribution that both Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples play to our continuing cultural development here in Queensland. Well, we're rather excited. It's really great to be able to talk to you about an exhibition that's been in development for around 4 years. So perhaps I'll kick off by introducing the place where these wonderful paintings come from. In broad terms, the exhibition comprises 65 paintings. Variously in the early section, they're paintings in tempera on wood panel, but most of the exhibition is oil on canvas of one kind or another. All of them come from this great building that sits between the eastern side of Central Park and also sits, of course, on the very famous Fifth Avenue. We've been very fortunate to develop a good relationship with the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Over a number of years, we worked with them on several occasions. This is, in fact, our third exhibition with the Met across time. But it's because of work happening in this little place, which I've just indicated at the top there, which are the daylit galleries that sit over the top of the European paintings collection at the Met, that really has made what we're doing today, having these paintings here in Brisbane, possible. So there's the Met. I think many of you in the room, I hope, have had the great privilege of going there. But one thing you'll find when you enter this exhibition is you see the paintings in a very different way, in both a different light and a different physical setting. Of course, we don't have the rather elaborate and grandiose galleries of the Met to work with, but we've built a rather elaborate, grandiose equivalent of how these paintings might be experienced through time. We'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But I had the opportunity to travel to the Met in 2018, met with the President and CEO of the Met, Daniel Weiss, talked to him about the possibility that the gallery might one day work with him to bring a group of pictures like this out to Australia, but didn't really leave that meeting believing that that was going to be possible. But as things transpired, the Met had been working quietly on the development of an exhibition, and they were taking the opportunity that arose as a consequence of work being done in the skylights, the natural daylit galleries, which sit above 44 individual rooms at the top of the Met on the 5th floor. And you can see from the slide there on the left-hand side some of the work that goes on to create a wonderfully now sophisticated admixture of LED light and natural daylight. So why is daylight important? Well, it's important because it is the optimal light in which painters work. And particularly in Europe, it's north-facing light because it gives the most even spread of light through the duration of the day. You're not getting the early sun in the morning and the late sunset in the afternoon, but you're getting a kind of middle light. And artists like Vermeer, for instance, worked in a top-windowed studio in his home in Delft, with his window, you guessed it, facing north. This is a very common thing for artists. So most, if not all of the paintings in this show would have been painted in some form of daylight, either top lit from a roof, as many did certainly in the Impressionist era, or Monet did with his very large glass windows at his atelier in Giverny, or others did in much smaller working spaces. And you'll see also on that slide 3 of the paintings that are in our exhibition. Now, I mean, this is something Geraldine and I have really marvelled at and been delighted by, that we are literally taking these paintings off the wall. As Michael Gallagher, the head of conservation at the Met, said at an event last night, none of them came out of storage. It's true. I've had the great privilege a few times of walking through and seeing all but 1 or 2 that might have been down for conservation or for some other reason over several visits to the Met. So this is the real privilege that the Met have extended to us here in Australia. So probably just to get our journey going, I'll say a little bit about the 3 chapters of the exhibition. The first chapter is titled Devotion and Renaissance, and essentially it's about public and private devotional images that were made by artist workshops to functionally serve as objects of adoration, veneration, and deep spiritual reflection. And Geraldine will talk about several of those in a moment. The Renaissance, of course, was that early part of the 15th century where Italy, in particular the nation-states or city-states of Italy, had moved from being under the thrall of the Middle Ages, which was not as dark a period as people paint it, but a period in which there were very hierarchical methods for painting. Figures were not generally anchored on the ground. They were set against a gilded landscape. They would appear to our eyes to be floating, almost in a hierarchy of importance. So the figure of Christ would be very large. The figure of a donor would be very small. All of these kind of, not quite empirical bits of scaling, but scaling according to status. In the Renaissance, you've got to remember that a lot of the literature coming up through the classical era, the Greek and Roman period in particular, which we'll touch on a few times as we go, a lot of that material ended up finding its way into the libraries of noblemen or into the libraries in particular of the church. And much of it was quite deliberately locked away by the church. And as things began to be gradually uncovered, particularly with the arrival of universities, the earliest university in the 12th century, in Italy, no less, and then the development of the printing press from about the 1440s that Gutenberg, of course, was responsible for, that really changed the way knowledge about the classical past circulated. That in itself became somewhat of a threat to the church. So in the next chapter, Absolutism and Enlightenment, it was not so much about devotional painting and sacred painting, but it was far more about the so-called divine right of kings. And particularly during the 17th and 18th century, it was believed that monarchs had often a God-given right to rule their people. In fact, the last king of France, Louis XIV, who Geraldine will talk about, really was the ultimate absolutist monarch around which the whole world turned, of course, until we get to the very next chapter. But just to say something about Enlightenment, it's a continuation really of the development of that humanist and classical relearning that was going on through the early Renaissance, led by great figures like Brunelleschi, the architect, by Giotto, the great early painter of the Renaissance, Raphael and Michelangelo later through that development of the Renaissance. This was the period of humanism, where the centrality of man and man's importance and agency as a sentient being was considered to be almost a threat in some ways to that view that all of us were God's children. And we were all born and would die God's children. So it was a very different kind of period when science in particular was being reborn, rational thinking. You think of Diderot and the publication of the world's first encyclopedia. That was that moment. Then with the revolution, the French Revolution in 1789, and subsequent revolts that occurred in France as well in the century that followed, all of a sudden, a lot of those precepts, principles and ideas were overturned. The king was no more, the nation-state held supremacy. And artists began, rather than to paint in a very doctrinaire and prescribed way, as they did during the early Renaissance, everything they painted was prescribed by the church or the donor who commissioned them to make that painting. But once we get to this moment, we're looking at artists who really have free will to paint as they choose. So to make this transition, we'll go through a little portal or doorway. And we've designed this in the exhibition to look much like that little colonnaded gallery on the top left of the slide, which was made in the 1560s, 1565, no, a bit later, 17th century, I should say. I've just tangled my date. You'll see it up there on the screen. This is a beautiful colonnade which is made to perspectively alter the way you enter the space. You'll see in the little plan map next to it that it narrows in and it lowers down. And as a consequence, you think you're walking into a space that physically seems about 40 metres long in the case of the original at Palazzo Spada in Rome. But in fact, you look through it and you see a sculpture at the end. It's a figure of a sculpture of Mars, in fact, the husband of Venus, who we'll meet in a moment. And you look through that, and he looks about 2 metres tall. You get up to him, and he's 60 centimetres tall. So it's designed to really shift your vision. So we're shifting our vision from 21st century Brisbane, don't we love it, into 15th century Italy. And this is where I'll pass over to Geraldine.
Yeah, and we've gathered, thanks so much, Chris, and we've gathered here, we're going to be giving you a focus in a way on, a kind of handful of works in the exhibition, but we wanted to bring up a few thematic threads which you might like to explore as you make your journey through the show. And this first one is about devotion and faith, and, as Chris mentioned, this is, a key theme to this first chapter of the exhibition. We have here a work by Gerard David that I'll speak about a little more, The Virgin and Child, Carlo Crivelli. These works almost from the beginning of the life of Christ. And then this full life cycle with, Raphael and Christ in the garden praying the evening before his crucifixion, which we then see represented by Fra Angelico. I suppose this cycle from birth to death of Christ was obviously a subject of faith and scripture and prayer, but also an opportunity to really think about people's own human experiences, the birth of their child, the death of one of their loved ones. And in this work by Giovanni Di Paolo, which I'll talk about a little bit more next, we see a vision of paradise. And, here people have passed beyond death, and they're in this first stage of gathering in the garden together. And imagine this moment. This was in some ways, not entirely different to this extraordinary moment we're living in at this time now with the coronavirus pandemic. Siena at this point in time, maybe about 100 years before this Di Paolo painted this work, had been ravaged by the plague, and perhaps 60% of the population had died. The beautiful cathedral of the city, they had begun to expand it, but that work was left unfinished, and the population never fully recovered. And so when Giovanni Di Paolo painted this work, I think this sense of the presence and the memory of those who had died, the fragility of life, and a desire to vividly imagine this next stage were very beautiful things. So here we see people gathered in paradise as a garden with flowers and hares under apple trees. And you'll see many of the people in this painting wear the black and white garments of the Dominican order, so both friars and nuns. We also have a fashionable pair of young women in the foreground, and people like Saint Augustine featured here. So all of these people are gathered in this garden before they, just at the top of the work, step into this next heavenly stage, guided by an angel. And next I wanted to talk about almost moving. You'll see in this first chapter of the exhibition, there's a real incredible body of Italian work, and this narrative where we see the emergence of the Renaissance, the beginnings of understanding around perspective, and we see this develop really quite swiftly in a very exciting way. And these ideas transfer from Italy to Northern Europe. And here Gerard David, painting in Bruges, has picked up this knowledge and, these Renaissance ideas. There's this beautiful triangular structure to the Virgin and Child. And he's representing here the story of the rest of the Holy Family as they are on the flight into Egypt. And it's a fascinating work because we kind of have one moment in the foreground with Mary feeding the Christ child by this beautiful translucent stream. But we have an earlier moment in the narrative in the forest that you'll just see kind of in the distance here. But I really encourage you to get up close to this beautiful work. Fortunately, it's framed glazed behind glass. And you'll see Mary on the donkey and Joseph behind her holding up this branch with 4 apples. And this was a detail that Chris pointed out to me, and he was like, look, they're just tiny. And then you see them beside her in this later, kind of, it's almost like a cartoon, bringing multiple moments together. So a very beautiful work, and also fascinating that the artist is painting her in the landscape of his home context in Northern Europe. So there's a Northern European town in the distance, and this was a subject that he returned to again and again, maybe 4 or 5 times, not hundreds of times, but he really wanted to perfect the subject and try it out in different iterations. So we have one of the final works in that evolution. It's incredibly beautiful, but I thought you might enjoy seeing this other version here, and maybe for all of us, practice can lead to greater perfection.
The other thing that's lovely about that painting is that little flash of red underneath that voluminous blue garment that, of course, the Virgin's wearing. And I can tell you, if you take that idea with you through this exhibition, you will find again and again artists use red as a way of creating a mid-distant or far-distant highlight that pulls the eye spatially through the painting. Poussin does it wonderfully in the big work we have by him in the exhibition, but you'll see it in the Dutch landscape paintings, you'll see it in numerous pictures throughout the exhibition. We have many sub-themes here, but red as a way of drawing you into a painting is certainly one of them.
And Chris, could I just mention on the red that it's very poignant. You know, I was talking about the cycle of Christ's life, and here we have this beautiful young baby and the family gathering to protect him. But the red, of course, symbolises his death to come, and so there's this sense of sadness and tragedy even at this calm moment.
Yeah. Well, given that we're discussing calm, this is a really crazy excursion to the left. Everything about the conversation you have in the first part of this exhibition is largely because of this devotional theme. It is about the connection between you and your God. This painting, however, by Pierrot de Cosimo, a Florentine artist this painting was made at the later part of the 15th century, so we're talking about 70, 60 odd years after the work we've just been speaking about. But for me, it's one of the most riveting paintings in the exhibition, and it is replete with so many curious and vast details. So the story of the painting is that it's based very broadly on some writing in a Latin text called De Rerum Natura, but no, I can't read it in Latin. So it really means about nature. It's a speculative poem about nature, and it was written by the Epicurean Roman philosopher and poet Lucretius, and he wrote this book in 1st century BC. And it really strongly influenced the Florentine humanists who were gathered around a number of the nobility, think of the Medici family and others working and living, really accumulating tremendous wealth at the time, with the power to be able to commission artists to make paintings not just about religious subject matter, but also more speculative paintings about the early origins of man. So this is clearly not about the fall of man in the Garden of Eden and man's ultimate redemption and salvation through Christ's death on the cross. Almost everything we've talked about to this point relates to that story. This is a very different story. This is a story of man and early humankind, you might say. We're almost Darwinian here rather than being biblical. And it's a fantastic, in the true sense of the term, combination of early man getting together with centaurs. And if you look closely, you'll see that half horse, half man from the torso up, in the mid-distance on the far right. And you'll also see satyrs, those goat hooved animals, part human, part goat, that you'll see recurring a number of times in this painting. But the basic story is that fire gave rise to all of these animals fleeing out into the open air, where early mankind, working in concert with mythological beasts, could hunt the animals. And I don't need to tell you, there's a bit of a pile-on, and particularly in the immediate left. It's just one thing upon another. It's a kind of a layer cake of chaos. And it's really quite funny that the satyr who's raising his club, which is exactly something that Lucretius talked about in his text, about to club the lion, guess what? There's a man also pulling against a bear, which is piling onto the lion, dressed in a lion skin. So it is just so rich and so vivid. The artist who painted it, not a lot is known about him in some ways, but if it's known through any source, it's through the great Vasari, the man who wrote the lives of the artists, the sculptors, and the architects. And there's a description by Vasari which has kind of led to this artist being almost rendered obscure in the story of art history. It's not that lionising, venerated life of Raphael or Michelangelo or Giotto. This is a very different life that Vasari tells. So I'll just read a short extract from it. As a youth, Vasari claimed, the artist, that's Pierrot, was likewise so great a lover of solitude that he knew no pleasure save that going off by himself with his thoughts, letting his fancy roam and building his castles in the air. He could not bear the crying of children, well, who can? The coughing of men, the sound of bells and the chanting of friars. And when the rain was pouring in torments from the sky, it pleased him to see it streaming straight down from the roofs and splashing on the ground. He had the greatest terror of lightning, and when he heard very loud thunder, he wrapped himself in his mantle, and having closed the windows and the door of the room, he crouched in a corner until the storm should pass. He was very varied and original in his discourse, and sometimes he said such beautiful things that he made his hearers burst with laughter. And when he was old and near the age of 80, he'd become so strange and eccentric that nothing could be done with him. So I wonder who'll write that biography of any one of us. But reading it, you can't but reimagine what an extraordinary figure, what an outlier he was. And there are other artists in the exhibition like Salvator Rosa, equally written up as kind of mad geniuses. But for many of them, they didn't land so well in the course of art history. Pierrot didn't, but I'm really glad we've got this painting here. It belongs to a kind of backboard. There's a companion piece to it with a very different subject matter of a return from the hunt, meeting up with women, taking their food on reed boats across the lake to safety, away from the wild animals of the forest nearby.
I think we have that one here, Chris, don't we, as the slide?
Well, we do.
Yeah.
I forgot to pass on the slide. Thank you, Geraldine. So
Such a
this is
tease.
it. This is the other painting in the Met. And there's a chest, a cassone, as it's called, that would have been used to hold bolts of fabric and precious garments and so on, usually in a bedroom. So this is one of those two paintings that actually sits up behind what would have been chests inside a domestic interior. So thank you for moving me on. I got a bit lost in that crazy life.
There's so much to explore.
There's a
isn't
lot
there?
to explore. He gives you a lot to work with. But this is, for me, one of the most affecting and wonderful paintings in the whole of the exhibition. It's by the great Venetian High Renaissance painter Titian, who was born in the Dolomites, about 90 miles or so from Venice, lived in Venice, worked there alongside two great artists, Gentili Bellini and Giovanni Bellini, and then at a later period of time spent time working with the very venerated Giorgione, one of the great, truly great painters. You might know his Tempesta in the Accademia, which is just one of the greatest paintings you can see in Venice. So this man is also responsible for another one of the greatest paintings you can see in Venice, which is the Assumption of the Virgin in the Frari. And it is a classical high Renaissance, but moving toward Baroque painting. But in this story, we've got Venus, it's clear who she is, holding on for dear life to her mortal lover Adonis, the handsome young huntsman, too good for himself. He was determined to leave her embrace and to go hunting. And you'll see he's holding his lance or spear in his right hand, holding onto the leash of his 2 hunting dogs, one of whom is kind of almost turning back as if to resist the movement forward, the other quite literally straining at the leash. And then the little figure of Cupid, who also happens to be the son of Venus and Mars, here holding a white dove, a messenger from the gods, which must have foretold that this journey into the forest, this hunt, would end badly. And indeed, moments after their embrace was broken, they did move into the forest, or he, I should say, did move into the forest, where he was gored in the groin by a Caledonian boar. This is not the way I want to go, but a very terrible, tragic tale. But as his blood spilled onto the ground, it was said that anemones grew from where that blood touched the ground. We've got a few stories about blood and flowers coming up, but this is a wonderful story told by Ovid, a great story, Metamorphosis, 250 different poems and stories about change, and often dramatic change within the course of our lives. And this, of course, is a scene of ill-fated love. And in the background, all of that wonderful, rich, vivid Venetian light is captured in the blue of the sky in the distance, in the drama and the miracle of the rainbow, the clouds parting, the light coming through. And when you look at this painting and look at it closely, because there is no glass, it is unframed, not unframed, it's beautifully framed in actually a contemporary Venetian frame, but there's no glazing. And when you look at it, you'll really see the scattering of the loaded brush over the top of the paint, over the top of the canvas surface, which is a very typically coarse Venetian canvas. Remember, this was a maritime city and a place in which big boats were built, sails were made, as well as ropes were produced in the arsenale, and it's almost like that rough cloth you could imagine that you'd have as a sail. And the paint lifts off its surface and scatters over the whole surface of the painting in a way that I can assure you Turner and Monet were aware of. He was a great influence, certainly on Turner. And this is one of the early classical sculptures that inspired that work. The Bed of Polyclitus, which actually shows the young figure of Psyche, literally removing bed clothing from her lover Cupid. So it's a little bit of an inversion of that Cupid story. But of course, I'm showing it to you so you'll see that coiled pose of Psyche herself, which of course is really caught in this painting by Titian. He called these paintings poesies, and he based the idea on the Roman writer Horace, who coined a phrase, ut pictura poesis, which means as you paint, as you hear poetry. Those two things have this kind of interchangeability. So a really wonderful painting. I'll hand over to you. Oh, it's to me.
Yeah.
We did try and get these segues going, but I'm getting too carried away. So this is just a very short little moment to look at, the wonderful work by Fra Angelico, a detail of it on the far left-hand side. Fra Filippo Lippi in the centre, the work by Lucas Cranach, and the work we've looked at a moment ago by Pierrot. You'll remember that deeply foreshortened figure on the right-hand side, and a small detail of the Poussin. And this is really to talk about perspective and to talk about the way in which artists in very early terms, such as Fra Angelico, that upraised head of that man clothed in a brown tunic in the centre there, that was a very unusual thing for artists to depict in a painting at this moment. And there are many other moments of those quite extreme foreshortening. In fact, the figure in the Piero di Cosimo reminds us of artists like Paolo Uccello. His Rout of San Romano has dead soldiers that occupy almost a similar kind of position in the painting. And in the Cranach, which is a wonderful picture, really urge you to have a close look at that one. I'm looking at more the aerial perspective, the fact these blue-greys of the distant light sort of suffuse the city almost magically in the background, but also give us a sense of the eye penetrating through great depth. And the Fra Filippo Lippi she's Madonna enthroned. She's sitting on a throne. And if we had the original frame of that work and seeing it in the context of a church, you'd clearly see that these frames are like windows on the world that often speak between the world of the painting and the world of the church in which the painting is placed. And you go into a place like the Frari where this tradition is best preserved. There's a beautiful chapel with a Gentile Bellini painting on the right-hand side after you've left the great vision of the Titian in the Frari, and you can actually see a painting with details of its frame, a frame itself, and then the window behind it, and they're all in the same kind of detailing. So just to give you a sense of the way frames really add to the way we create space. We're now moving into Absolutism and Enlightenment. We've just moved into the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. We've recreated that experience down to the last square metre here in the Queensland Art Gallery, if you know it. We might sign some international treaties in there while we have it, but a wonderful space, but to really announce the Baroque, which this section does. One of the key motifs of the exhibition as well is the role of Cupid. I've talked about him already in the Titian. We'll see him in a moment in the Caravaggio. But look at that cute little guy who's at the bottom right-hand corner of a Jean-Baptiste Greuze painting called The Broken Egg. And it's a kind of corny moral tale, really. There's a few moral tales here. The De la Tour you're going to talk about, but this is one of the more sort of slightly comical ones. And this little boy who looks like the embodiment of mischief, note that there's a bow and arrow by his right-hand side. So he's like a genre form of Cupid. And over on the top left-hand slide, again, back from a detail in the Lucas Cranach, is a little figure of Cupid who's pointing his arrow as Paris determines which woman is the fairer. His arrow, of course, is pointed into the heart of Venus, into which, of course, he would fall in love, and that would become his passport to meet Helen of Troy, and Venus would be ditched. So these love stories between mortals and ordinary human beings throughout this exhibition, I'll give you the tip, they all end badly. The gods live on, the mortals die. So lots of these great stories. So this is a really wonderful painting. We're very, very lucky to have it. Caravaggio's The Musicians. And it's a painting that is one of the more sort of intimate and absorbing pictures, I think, to go up and look at closely. The main elements are of this work that four youths are gathered together, one of whom happens to be the mythological figure of Cupid. You'll see his black wings just over his shoulder and his arrows just peeking out from the other right-hand side shoulder. He's about to pluck a grape. And then you'll see the lutenist sharpening up or tuning up his lute. The small figure with his back to us reading a score, which has been, scholars have determined, is a sheet of music, although indecipherable, is the form in which madrigals were written. So we're not using devotional music, we're using secular music at this moment. And then the figure behind playing that instrument or about to play that black horn instrument that just appears over the foreground youth's shoulder. That is a self-portrait of Caravaggio himself. And he often did place himself in these paintings. Not in this one. It's the same lutenist here, tuning up the lute in the Hermitage, actually seen playing it with that wonderful still life, for which also was a particular genre of painting for which Caravaggio was famed when he first came to Rome. So he arrived in Rome in his early 20s, in the 1590s, and he was taken up under the patronage of Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, lived in this vast Palazzo Moderno in Rome. And inside there, he built around him a coterie, mainly of young men. I leave the rest to your imagination. And they would entertain him regularly with small concert parties. And this one, in which the figures are clothed in sort of quasi-classical Roman attire, look as if they're kind of recreating some sort of idyll that would have occurred, as the Roman poets might have written about it. But there's a sensuosity, there's an intimacy, almost an insouciance on the looks and the lips of those young men. And it's a very beautiful, very sensual painting, and a very intimate one because the figure's back is placed right on the edge of the picture plane, as if he's sort of bumping into the glazing, you might say. And as a consequence of that, you as the viewer, I think, feel really drawn in to the space that they live in. So this is a very different kind of painting, a little bit later than the work we've just been looking at, but I think a work that we both love. How many times do we really get to talk about a Rembrandt in the gallery? Wouldn't it be good if we had one? We actually have a wonderful Rubens in our collection. Actually, Rubens, which is a painting based on another painting by Titian, which is in a German collection. But this is a painting too, which pays a lot of deference and homage to the great artist Titian. And as it happened in Amsterdam, when Rembrandt was living there, the Spanish ambassador of the day had owned the painting on the right-hand side by Titian, which is also an image of Flora. Flora was the goddess of spring, not a particularly well-known goddess, not like Venus or Mars, but the goddess nonetheless who was responsible for casting flowers onto the ground to announce the arrival of spring and spring weather. And in this particular case, what Rembrandt has done is, rather than using a somewhat younger and more idealised figure of Flora, as Titian has, he's based the facial features and the figure on his late wife, who died 12 years earlier, Saskia van Lindenberg, and also his, at that point, companion, Heinrich Stoffels. And he's sort of created something of a hybrid of their facial features with probably more bias to Saskia. And we know that because in the early phases of their marriage, he painted Saskia as Flora on 3 separate occasions. So he saw this as a painting of love. And the chemise that she's wearing is one you couldn't have painted your lover in, or your wife. It had to be allegorically depicted as this goddess of spring, and thus you can see the chemise is very similar to the Venetian chemise that's in the painting to its right. But it's the drama and pure painterly energy of this picture, I think, that gets me, that you are seeing paint turn into material, sunlight being caught in that upraised dress, and the carnation, back to flowers falling on the ground. The carnation was said to be a flower that grew in the place where Christ's blood was shed at the base of the cross in Golgotha. But by the same token, they were also a flower of love and marriage, which takes us back to that connection. I'll hand over to Geraldine.
And this work by Georges de la Tour, in a way, there's a nice link to Caravaggio. There's a number of links to Caravaggio. The kind of space where this drama plays out has this shallowness, this beautiful dramatic quality of light and shadow. But this is also a subject that Caravaggio had painted, the Fortune Teller, a relatively simple painting of just a young man and young woman, and he's having his fortune told. And here, Georges de la Tour, actually, Chris, sorry to go to and fro, but I might get you to go on one. And we can see Caravaggio's version of the work. So Caravaggio was enormously influential. And I think one of the lovely things about this exhibition is, we have these figures who were, icons in their day, and their reputation just flowed on enormously, and others who are perhaps, less well known, but really strong and wonderful works. And maybe if you can click back one now. Sorry, I'm sending us. Oh no, maybe we'll stay here actually with Georges. And
we never did crack the 2 clickers.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm driving.
Yeah. And so Georges de la Tour, the work we have in the exhibition, which is the major image here, I think is such an intriguing work, and it's been wonderful to see it used, to welcome all of you to the building and on the streets. The glances between the different people here are really intriguing. So, perhaps there's many layers of narrative, but the first layer might be to imagine this young man has just stopped down an alleyway and taken up the invitation of this gypsy lady to have his fortune read. And so he's offered her a coin. She's telling him him something, we'd love to know what that is. Meanwhile, the beautiful young companions of the gypsy are picking his pocket and robbing him. So we can see this beautiful kind of peacock blue kind of braided item being lifted out of his orange trousers, and then there's this radiant young woman who's snipping the chain that he has like slung across his shoulder to release yet another medallion. So there's something very kind of funny about this and the different glances, but there's also this this number of other layers to the work. A detail that I love is that his fingers have a little black rim, so it's like he looks quite clean, but there's a little bit of dirtiness there.
Yeah.
And the young woman who's looking at him with the kind of cloth wrapped around her head, she's thought to represent a figure from a novella by Cervantes called La Gitana, which was the young gypsy girl. And it's a story about a young girl who's of noble birth and brought up by gypsies, and later falls in love with a nobleman. And there are many layers about class and privilege and presentation and trust, the unfolding of life.
Yeah.
But I think this kind of radiant connection and almost maybe sense of romance as they gaze towards each other is quite beautiful. And I would just commend you also. I was going to mention a little about another work of his, the cheat with the ace of clubs or spades, and we can see he is a master at representing costume and these moments of intrigue.
And that history of drawing from Caravaggio as well. Usually in these close-up figure studies of Caravaggio, there's always a blank background. So it's a wall or it's nothing.
Yeah.
The same thing happens in most of the work by Rembrandt that we could be talking about, and it certainly happens with Georges de la Tour, his painting of the Magdalene. Wherever you look at different paintings, that wonderful one from the Kimball, there's just there's a void space. And so it's interesting, in the next painting, we've got a background that supplies a whole other narrative beyond the figure in the foreground.
Yeah. And this is such an intriguing work, but I'm going to pick up our pace here because I'm aware we're getting really drawn into these fabulous narratives. And we're delighted together with Caravaggio to have this work by Marie-Denise Villers on the cover. So if you buy one of the publications, there's a really exciting choice to make of which one.
We're running a book actually on which will sell the most.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh.
And it's this is so exciting, this work, because it's one of two paintings by women in the exhibition. And I think we all know it's not always easy to have the opportunity, particularly at this point in time, to create your own practice and voice as a female artist. And Marie-Denise Villers was 25 years old when she painted this work. She was a young student, so she's made a portrait of her fellow student, Charlotte Duval-Dogne, and they're working together. They're learning to make paintings in the Louvre, which at this time, after the French Revolution, was, parts of it were used by artists as studios, and they would have been artists of much greater reputation, but some of them were supporting and enabling young women to learn to paint. So she's very fashionably dressed in this Neo-Grecian style. So again, we have this theme of picking up the knowledge and inspiration from ancient Greece and Rome, and kind of recasting that in exciting new ways. And there's also this great story with this work that it was thought to be by the great artist David, and was in the Met's collection, and much admired, still much admired today, but later realised through an art historian finding it in a catalogue of the Salon of the year 1801 when it was painted, and realising it couldn't have been by David. He didn't show that year, and so this kind of art historical detective moment ensued. But I'll pass back to Chris for our next work.
Well, we're just going to talk briefly about children. I mentioned the use of red, we did mention Cupid as well, but probably horses could be another subset.
Yes, ponies.
But just to indicate ponies and wooden horses, this is remarkably filled with beautiful portraits of young children, and that very, very tender work we're looking at by Dirk Boats in the base there, central base image. The exquisite tenderness between that mother and child
so
really
tiny.
is about all time. It's not just about the religious meaning of that. The little image of Jean on his hobby horse on the top right. Monet's son, they'd recently moved into a suburban part of Paris on the edge of the river, and that was his young son trying out his tricycle. Our animation team have even made him ride it at one point, if you're very alert, in the next gallery. And a beautiful painting of two young sisters by Fragonard. If you want to see rich, splendid paint handling, there's a great example. In the Albert Coip, two young boys who are being tutored. They're on horseback. They're about to go on a hunt. Coachman standing nearby and
like
resplendent.
little men, aren't they?
They are
those
little men,
boys?
and they're not dressed in local costume. It's kind of Austrian in origin, I think, the costume, rather than Dutch. And the very beautiful Reynolds, which sits to the left-hand side of the villas we've been talking about, and young Pepito. Beautiful painting by Goya. We would love to have an entire Goya exhibition, but this is nice to have in the building on its own. So I'll just make very brief remarks about this wonderful studio that's been built in the Long Gallery. If you've not been in, you'll soon be introduced to it. This is us when we're in our planning stages. Wait till you see it today. It's very rich and resplendent. We've set things like the Cranach and the Poussin up as kind of backgrounds. We've also got other paintings we've activated that you can pose in front of, like the very beautiful one of The Girl on the Seashore by Renoir. And then we've done a terrific deep dive into symbolism and meaning of these works, which you can interact with. Every artist has a life story. And on your telephone, we've got about 2 and a bit hours of stories that our volunteer guides wrote the great majority of, recorded the great majority of, together with Geraldine and myself and our conservators. So you can go around and look at this show almost on a theme. It's not like a usual, the old kind of audio guide, some authoritative voice taking you from one work to the next to the next. Well, we've got about 50 voices in this, and we think this is a great way of being very egalitarian in a moment when our guides can't do guided tours. And I actually feel for them. I love doing guided tours, but I feel for the fact that they can't do that on an ordinary basis in the show, just because of COVID limiting the numbers we can have in close proximity, etc. But we've given you their voice and their experience and their insight. Nonetheless, it's all available for you. Musicians from the con, musical instruments from the con. You'll hear the sound of some of the instruments like the lute we talked about actually being played.
So much to explore,
it's just,
there?
Honestly, we might shut the rest of the show, I think, but there's a lot going on in that central space.
Yeah.
So just to kind of take us home, I think...
and I think I'll cover this one, and we just went another... suggested trail or motif to explore was to look at the way in which light is represented through the exhibition. And, I think it's a 500-year tour. And if you imagine for much of this period, if it's not daylight, it's candlelight. And it's really only towards the end of the exhibition that there's the possibility of electric light. So light has this incredibly magical quality, and it's evoked through the way that pigment is applied and layered. And I think this sense of space and light interacting together. So
that slide could be some of my favourite moments in the show. I mean, that golden light in the skirt of Flora, the light that seems to almost emanate from the Christ child in the El Greco, which
quite
is one
spooky in a way.
It's extraordinary. Honestly, I feel if we turned the lights out, it'd still be there somehow. It's a bit like that Goya 3rd of May, if you know that painting in the Prado. Honestly, if they left the lights out, I think you can still see this lamp that lights up the soldiers, the firing squad, the man in front of the haystacks. It's that kind of light that's quite miraculous, and that beautiful light folding into the skirt of Villiers' painting as well. And obviously, as you'll talk about next, I think, the light in Venice.
Yeah, and so this work takes us into the final chapter of the exhibition, Revolution and Art for the People, and one form of revolution occurring as we enter this final chapter is this revolution in how paint was handled and how artists were making work. We see this kind of movement towards a greater freedom and in the end almost abstraction. At times Turner, the sense of atmosphere in this work, this beautiful painting of Venice, we very much can recognise the city, but he's celebrating this beautiful light, the way that it radiates through the sky and shimmers on the water of the canal, these beautiful colours, these greens and blues. And we have a few little images here just to show you some of the sketches that he made when he visited Venice, just a couple of times, making pencil sketches and watercolours, capturing really swiftly. He's so inspired by his time in the city, the nature of the architecture and also this sense of colour. And then going back to the studio and making these quite large-scale, sumptuous paintings. So they're this beautiful kind of memory construction and impression of his time in Venice. And then the next artist that I would like to talk with you about, Honoré Daumier, immediately a much darker work and kind of a different side to this subject of revolution. The initial French Revolution, I suppose, wasn't the only one of this period and kind of kicked off this huge wave of political unrest. Also, there's kind of social changes with technology, the Industrial Revolution, the whole shape of cities changing. This work shows people on the third-class carriage, which would have been, so the whole train network, which was taking people in and out of the cities, changing the whole structure of the city, the suburbs, how people worked. But here you see people in these carriages which didn't have any glass in the windows, and it's a tough, hard, cold bench. But here we have a family, perhaps a mother, her daughter with her child, another child, and travelling in this train compartment. Also a version of the painting in Canada, which is a much more finished version. But I think it's interesting that the really iconic work that we're so thrilled to have in this exhibition shows some of its grid that gives you a sense of it being a work in progress. But I think it's fascinating because of the rawness, in a way, this sense of line work. It reminds us of Daumier's profession in parallel and earlier in his life also as a cartoonist. And we thought you might enjoy this image of he made of King Louis Philippe, and in fact it landed him in prison for 6 months. And we see the king kind of engorging the wealth of the country and the people who are supporting him. So, Daumier was really quite, socially engaged and passionate about the role of art in reflecting the world and the experience of people.
And it's wonderful that you mentioned the gridding. There are 2 paintings in particular. I'm urging you to look at everything really closely, because that's what will bring this exhibition to life, not us talking about it, but looking and finding things that I assure you will be different every time you return back to see those paintings. That sounded like I'm selling a season pass, but it's a very good idea. But when you look at this painting, there's the grid that Geraldine referred to, and the grid, of course, is that the painting was not sketched immediately directly onto the canvas. It was drawn on a sheet, and then a grid of a certain number of vertical and horizontal lines would then be enlarged onto the broader canvas so that the little compositional elements all the way through the composition from the foreground to the middle to the background of the painting can all be accurately scaled up from a smaller drawing. And being a lithographer, he was a pretty astonishing draftsman. So what you're also seeing is pen marks on the edge, particularly of the outline of the nursing mother on the left-hand side, and you'll see the way a painting is made, really, when you look at this painting. And another one I ask you to look at as well in that same regard is a beautiful work by Cézanne. We've got two Cézannes in the exhibition of the village of Gardanne. And in that particular painting, you'll also see the sketched pencil marks where he's literally kind of working out the way in which the buildings are placed and disposed through the landscape, looking up, ultimately up to a church spire up on the hillside. So we're lucky to have a couple of paintings in the show that, in a way, explain painting. And I don't think this painting needs any introduction at all. I mean, we're very thrilled to have this work by Van Gogh in the exhibition. It's one of 14 paintings of an orchard, various orchards in and around Arles in Provence, which he painted in 1888, having just really quite newly fled from Paris, which he found a pretty chaotic part of his life, where his brother was, of course, living and working as an art dealer. And he went to Provence, and in a kind of fever pitch of preparation for what would eventually be a visit by Paul Gauguin, also in the exhibition. This was one of a series of paintings he made to kind of announce the beginning of spring. It's back to Flora. These are the carnations scattering on the ground, but in this case, the blossoms of fruit or nut trees, whatever they might be. But one of the beautiful stories of this group of paintings is how much Van Gogh had fallen in love with Japanese ukiyo coloured woodblock printing. And since Japan was open to the world in the 18th century, 1700s, all of a sudden it was possible for these Japanese prints to be imported into Paris. And artists like Picasso and Braque, and particularly Degas, that often angled view of a stage you get in ballerinas performing or practicing, rehearsing behind the curtain, an example of which we have here, that often emanates from two sources: the use of the camera or the use of the compositional structure of a ukiyo print, which was teaching new ways of kind of seeing the world that was post-Renaissance. Really, it wasn't until the Cubists shattered that Renaissance view of the world, but this is part of what led to that shattering, you might say, by working in a very different and a more angular approach to organising a scene in space. So if you look at the print by Hiroshige, which was owned by Theo and Vincent, in that particular work you'll see very much the compositional origins of our painting, particularly that sort of awkward, multi-times pruned, old, angular look of the fruit tree. And of course, this is, of all of the paintings he made at this moment, only a couple of them showed tools or implements left behind by the gardeners. Most were just unpopulated by any human presence. You'll see too this commonality of dividing it up into a kind of a green zone, then a fence line on the horizon, then a sky. And if you look closely at the painting, you'll also see that there's a kind of pink blush to the sky itself. And when the painting is unframed and being examined for conservation purposes, it's very clear that that sky, the pigment used to paint that sky, has been a very fugitive colour and has lost all of its kind of redness. And now it's a kind of small blush of colour rather than that intensity. And you look back to the Hiroshige and you really can almost recompose that painting in your mind's eye as its palette was meant to be.
And that would have been the exposure to light, wouldn't it, Chris?
Absolutely.
That's faded it. So it's fascinating. You could take a tour through this exhibition, just the history of pigments, their trade and circulation and use, stability or instability.
And when things are overpainted, like the little Bible being held by the Christ child in The Madonna and Child by Filippo Lippi, you'll see that Filippo Lippi painted the Virgin's dress down deeper to cover up the book because he thought the book looked too big. But now what you'll see is the shadow of the book. It's called pentimenti. So old paint which dries and hardens, even when new paint's put over it, that old paint's fighting to kind of come through the surface, but not a problem here. But with this picture, you'll also see that Van Gogh himself painted a version of the print that we just looked at.
I love the way he's got the, I assume it's kanji script along the sides.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So we've actually come pretty much right on time to the final painting of the exhibition, a painting which I'm sure that many people are looking forward to seeing. But can I caution you, don't just think, let's pick this trail to the Monet. Look really carefully at everything that leads up to it. Monet could never have been Monet, could never have made the discoveries he made, could never approach painting in the way that he did without the influence of people we've already talked about, not least Titian, not least Turner. Turner was a huge influence on Monet. So by the time you get to this painting, which seems to almost dissolve space rather than give you a construction of space as you might find it in Caravaggio or particularly Poussin, a very formally organised space, here we're looking at water in his garden about 50 k's northwest of Paris. He was 50. He decided to leave Paris to set this new garden up, bought some property. There was a stream running through it, then bought an adjacent property, and he developed that garden, remember my mention of the ukiyo print tradition, into a kind of Japanese garden, even building this Japanese bridge, which is the subject of the Monet painting that's for one more day in the National Gallery show in Canberra. So you can see, though, in that photograph, the density of the appearance of these water lilies. So you're both looking at water and its surface. You're looking at the sky reflecting back from that surface. You're looking at willow fronds, which are just dappling down, touching, almost kissing the surface of the water, being reflected back up into it, and holding all of this together in a way compositionally are the water lilies themselves. And in a tale often told, he would have his gardeners row out not only to tidy up the appearance of the water lilies, if they'd been disturbed by a storm or something overnight, but it's also said he's somewhat of a precursor to Jackson Pollock, who would paint vast areas of canvas and compose by cutting the canvas to a certain dimension. That great painting of his, Lavender Mist, was cut out in such a way. So you compose by looking at what you've created rather than creating all of the limits of the composition to the edge of the canvas. And in a way, if you've seen the Nymphaeus in the Orangery, those big circular galleries, you can get up to those paintings and look at things like this and see the touch of the hand in a way that we've been describing it about people like Titian, other artists in the exhibition. Velázquez is a great example of that, or Fragonard. But the paint here almost tells us that we're on the edge of the abstract abyss. Abstraction was really invented well before this. It wasn't just an invention of Malevich, the great Russian suprematist. When you look at early watercolour sketches, his colour notes, as he called them, by J.M.W. Turner, that's as close as you get to this. He was doing those in the 18th century. So this exhibition takes us on, I think, a pretty wonderful ride. I think you can tell we're a little bit passionate about it. But so if there's been a surfeit of, enthusiasm, forgive us. But it's so good having them in our building and our city in this time and in this place. And I really, really hope you enjoy seeing the exhibition and return to it often. Thank you very much.